Salutations. Today I'm going to be talking about combat. Now, I know what you're thinking. What exactly is combat? Or maybe instead you're wondering, why should I care about combat? Well, today I'm in that mood again where I want to enlighten people about combat. So I'm going to do exactly that and discuss all matters pertaining to combat. Hopefully by the end of this video, you have a deeper understanding of what makes combat
The new video computer system by Atari. More games, more fun.
The second generation of video games is upon us. Companies such as Magnavox, Coleco, and even Nintendo have made pretty simple video game consoles that generally just played Pong or played variations of it. In the mid-1970s, our protagonist of the story, Atari, would toy around with the idea of a video game console that could switch games interchangeably via the use of cartridges. No longer would games be confined to whatever the system was designed around, but rather, any crazy wild games developers felt like making. Though ideas and concepts were shot and spat around since 1975, some real deal progress would begin to be made by fellows Joe DeCure and Jay Miner, creating what would eventually become the Atari 2600. While that was going on, they were also tasked with creating a game that would demonstrate the capabilities of the system. This originally started out as a port of one of Atari's arcade games from 1974, Tank! However, further development and completion of the game would get tossed over to Larry Wagner, who helped refine the game engine and added a buttload of wacky fun features. A two-player game that let you control tanks, biplanes, and jets. This would become the game now known as Combat. On September of 1977, Combat would have released alongside the Atari 2600 with 8 other launch games. So why am I looking at Combat in particular, not, I don't know, basic math? Well, Combat seems to have the closest development with the Atari 2600, sharing some of the same developers, and the game was actually bundled in with the system until 1982. Plus, the game code is CX2601, which from what I understand is the lowest of all the codes, so why not? That's the development history of Combat, but what's my experience with the game? Well, I'm a baby child, what do you expect? I was triple not alive during the time this game came out, so all I can do is assume gaming in the 70s looked like this! To anyone who's much more knowledgeable in this era of video games, or perhaps even lived through it, you'll have to excuse me. What's probably stupid basic information to you is pretty darn fascinating to me. For example, apparently as a result of Atari being partnered with Sears, they just straight up let them copy the Atari 2600 and sold it as the Sears Video Arcade. That's nuts! Also, the Atari 2600 wasn't even called that for the majority of its life. It was the Atari Video Computer System. And everything about this advertisement is just incredible to me. According to Atari, every game they produce has 14 to 50 game variations. Well, fiddle my tittle! And they even made the bold claim that their video game console was so technologically advanced that it would still be up to snuff in the year 1983. Ho, I hope so too. And while we're on the topic of totally whatever information that's quite interesting to myself, an important part of reviewing Combat is understanding the era that it came out in. This was before video games were huge experiences, had full-fledged worlds, caused websites to crash because of some blog dude being in the same game as Mr. Anime Schmanime here. Video games weren't really a hobby, but just a way to fill the time. Because of that, it's unfair to compare Combat to newer games now that people have much higher expectations for the industry. Really, whether or not this game is successful as a video game of its time simply depends on if it's a fun enough distraction from watching Speed Racer on the telly. So let's put that theory to the test. Will Combat for the Atari 2600 be able to alleviate the boredom of a family of two hands? Let's find out by seeing how this glorious game looks and plays. Brace yourself, losers, the future is now. Upon playing the game for the first time, it appears as if we can do just about 3 things: move, fire, and get beaten up. The objective is pretty simple: be the guy who has more points, which are gone by successfully landing shots on the other player. Whenever you get smashed, there's a pause and some knockback that's supposed to distance the two of you some. If this happens to occur near a wall, you wrap around the screen, which is funny, but I don't know, I found it's also way too easy to get juggled by another player, depending on whether or not your luck is good that day. Also, there's this totally random feature where by changing the direction of your tank after firing a missile, the trajectory of your shot changes too. This can lead to pretty rad trick shots and it's honestly kind of fun. So the two of you, or the two of your hands, mess around for a while, absolutely hammering each other with unhealthy shots to the face, and then the score numbers begin to flash. What does that mean? It means the game is about to abruptly, and I mean abruptly, end. Well then, of course, that's something you would have already known about if you had transported your viewing gaze on over to Combat's manual. You know how reading video game manuals has been a laughingstock for decades? Well, you pretty much need to read the manual for this game to fully understand what the heck is going on. This is where you learn about the timer of the game, the controls, difficulty options, among other things, but most importantly, you get a chart of this game's 27 game variations. Wow, so that sure is a lot. Here's the catch. Atari pretty much counted any possible configuration of game options, no matter how minor they are, as their own game. A better way to describe all of this is 3 games with different game options available. Am I going to go over all of them? Yes, I am! First, of course, we've got our big chunky tank game for big men. The controls are tank controls, haha, and different game variations determine the types of shots you fire, as well as the map where the wham blam slam jam of the century occurs. There's 3 map types: open field, easy maze, and complex maze. I think the first is a little too bland and open for a game with as slow moving vehicles as this. So if you want the definitive tank simulator for your Atari 2600, you can thank me later for choosing the cooler and less lame maps. The other main difference between tank variations is whether or not your missiles change direction upon rotating, or not. That's all. Next on our list of major categories of games is Tank Pong, the game for people in the family who have completely lost their minds. Tank Pong is literally just tank, but now your shots ricochet off of walls. Amazing. In addition to already existing map variations, you can now choose between whether or not shots will be able to land on opponents no matter what, or if they have to bounce off of a wall once before being viable for a point. This definitely makes this mode a little more strategic in theory, but for me, it just results in launching shots randomly and giggling to the funny noises. Speaking of, this seems like a good time to bring up this game's sound design. Unironically good, I must confess. This bad boy only had 2 audio tracks to work with, and it's used quite well to emphasize the tankiness of those tanks you seem to be handling. The bouncing shot sounds are wonderfully goofy, and that noise when you land a hit has the perfect amount of satisfying crunch. This game also has a really good soundtrack with the following number of songs. 0. Our next game is Invisible Tank. So basically, if you don't have a missile on screen, your tank stays invisible. Kinda silly, don't you think? After Invisible Tank comes Invisible Tank Pong. Really? Yes, both regular Tank and Tank Pong have versions where your tanks are invisible most of the time, and they're both counted as their own games with their own game variations as well. Kinda really stupid if you ask me, and I don't think being invisible makes much of a difference when, you know, your location is revealed when you fire a missile. Anyway, just like before, the main variations consist of the map you duke it out on, and if you play the Pong version, then you have the choice between direct hit and billiards hit. Play this game with invisible tanks, Pong mode, billiards mode, and on a maze, and you've got yourself a game that can only truly be described as... What is this? Finally, we've made it past the tank fad of 1977. Say hello to Biplane! This is awesome! An aerial dogfight up in the clouds, or not if you prefer, with a selection of 3 weapons. The already seen straight missiles, the already seen guided missiles, and the machine gun! Yeah! What the hell are these controls? No, seriously, why would they do this? Over here in this little box of disappointment, they say how, unlike all other game modes, Biplane is meant to be played with a side view perspective instead of an overhead view. Okay, one question. Why? All this does is seriously jumble up the controls. So rather than what the controls should have been, push left or right to turn left or right, they're this! Without understanding the perspective of the game, it's super jarring when you're moving right and you have to push up to go down, then when you move left, that's suddenly reversed. They did draw the sprite so the planes are actually upside down like this, so it makes kinda sense. But it's still just so confusing when there could have been, and for all we know is, a much nicer control scheme. Machine gun is pretty nice though. It's a shame they had to butcher the controls here because the game variety is actually really fun here. The machine gun modes, I think that speaks for itself. There's a 2v2 mode where both players are twice as more likely to dog and get dogged. That one's pretty fun and dumb. And then the 1v3 mode. This is completely ridiculous, but it's so much fun seeing big balls get flung around as well as plenty of small tiny balls. Honestly, I think the 3 planes have an advantage over the big planes since theoretically they have a smaller overall hitbox. Still very fun though. Wow, that sure was nice, but it looks like we need to get back to questioning this game's design. Imagine if you took Biplane, fixed up the controls, but then didn't carry over the best part of the game. You get Jet. So Jet actually plays with an overhead view in mind, meaning the controls are exactly what I wanted them to be for Biplane. That's most bodacious. What's the catch? They took out the machine gun modes. Mr. Wagner, what did humanity do to deserve this? The better controls do mean that the modes shared between both Biplane and Jet, those being the 1v1 fights with regular weapons, are far nicer here and pretty fun. It doesn't feel like total barf to control anymore. Wow! I just don't understand why the machine gun modes had to be taken out when, you know, it's the most enjoyable part of combat. Also, for whatever reason, the 1v3 game mode is just 1 regularly sized jet against 3 also regularly sized jets, which I'm pretty sure gives the singular player an advantage since they can't get hit as often. But all things considered, Jet is probably a better game mode compared to Biplane, well with the controls being the opposite of garbage and whatnot, but the loss of our beloved machine gun mode won't be forgotten. Well, look at that! All game modes have been discussed and talked about by myself, so I think there's only one more thing to talk about before I've literally discussed the entirety of combat's gameplay. As explained by our lovely manual over here, this game has difficulty settings kinda sorted out really. each player can choose between A and B difficulties, which dictates the following. Those two things. Yeah, honestly I don't even have gameplay footage of this because I completely forgot to even mess around with it. But, if you want to enter the minds of Atari, you could say that since there are 4 different combinations of difficulties across 2 players, multiply that with 27 game modes, and BAM! 108 game modes, oh yeah! And with that, I'm totally dry and things to talk about. That means we're entering spoiler territory! Now, to those of you who watched the first video on my channel, you may recall that I totally forgot to include a spoiler warning. Anguish and agony soon followed, I'm sure, so today marks the bold day where I actually remember to include a spoiler warning. Here you go! Now that we're done talking about spoilers, it's time to give my closing thoughts on this game. Quick thing, however, there's a tradition I wanted to do where I play a remix of a song from this game that I just covered during the closing thoughts, because that just seems like a cool and hip thing to do. I did that in my other video. However, I have a hunch that not a lot of people have made remixes of this game's great soundtrack, so I've decided to use the next best thing and use a remastered version of this game's sound effects as background music. Combat for the Atari 2600 is the very definition of a video game. You might be thinking, wow, this game looks lame. Yeah, it does, but hear me out. This game may be aged, this game may be simple, but it achieves one thing it really needed to be. It's fun! Sometimes you need a game like Combat every once in a while to remind you that, at their core, video games only have to be fun to be cool. Keep in mind that I was playing against myself when I enjoyed this game. Imagine playing this back in 1977 with your compadres, absolutely demolishing their tanks and their feelings. In terms of fun, this game has stood the test of time, and some newer games can't say the same. Now, there is a pretty good chance that you, watching this video, have not played anything past the 3rd generation of video games. I didn't before making this video. Well, why not give one a shot then? In my opinion, I think a true fan of video games should be able to appreciate any generation of the medium. You don't have to like them necessarily, but I think learning and experiencing the past is really fun nonetheless. When I came up with reviewing this game, I thought, haha, this will be a funny 5-minute video. Then I traveled across the great internet plains and learned more about the game, learned more about its development, learned more about the era. So then I thought, okay, maybe everything but the game itself will be interesting to talk about. Honestly, that might still be true, but I was still surprised by how much I enjoyed this stupidly simple game. You could say playing Combat for the Atari 2600 opened my eyes, and will surely be on my mind while I continue to play Mario Party Superstars on my Nintendo Switch. If you're playing Cookie Clicker and you think to yourself, how did we get here? Give a game like Combat a try. It may be old, it may be aged, it may be old and aged with completely whatever presentation, but it'll be a nice distraction and possibly a new experience. Well, that's the end of that. I've noticed that I haven't dated this video yet or made any one-frame comments about my writing skills, so I feel the desperate need to mention that if any of what I just said was unorganized or messy or whatevs, then whoops. But care I do not, because that's the end of my second game review. Hopefully things were better this time around, and hopefully me reviewing Combat of all games sets as a reminder to you all that I know no boundaries for games to be reviewed, so please, be scared. And with that, I've got to scramble. Valedictions!